The ancient forest loomed around Sarah, trees hoary and gnarled, their twisted limbs reaching towards a slate-gray sky. The farther she walked, the quieter the world became. There was no wind, or birds, or insects, just a heavy silence that pressed down on her like a weighted blanket she'd never asked for. Many people had heard of Aokigahara Jukai, the infamous suicide forest of Japan, where countless people had chosen to end their lives. But that wasn't the only forest in the world with such a reputation. The Nachtschattenwald in Germany, the Selva do Esquecido in Brazil. We're in Yarra Forest in Australia, and just a few miles outside Sarah's hometown, Black Hollow. She tightened her grip on the leather-bound notebook clutched against her chest. The cracked spine felt fragile beneath her fingers, the scent of old paper mingling with that of damp earth. She knew the contents of every page by heart now, every ink-smudged word. But it was the final entry that had been plaguing her mind for weeks, unraveling her sleep and sinking its dark roots into her thoughts.
I'm sorry. I tried to escape it, but the only way to stop it is to pay its price. Forgive me.
The words had been written by her grandmother's trembling hand. Her grandmother, who had always hummed while she worked away at her medicines, who'd smelled of lavender and chamomile, and strange herbs known to few natives and even fewer white folk, who'd told her bedtime stories about lost spirits and magic charms, and the importance of never looking back in the dark. Her grandmother, who died peacefully in her sleep, or so Sarah had been told. Sarah's mother had kept the truth buried along with her grief, but the notebook had been left behind, tucked away in a drawer of her mother's old desk. A confession, a warning, a final, desperate hope. Appalachia was full of ghost stories and legends, especially up in the Allegheny Highlands where Sarah was born, and of them Black Hollow featured prominently. The lonely woods were known to attract those who wanted to end themselves, and over the decades, hundreds had done so. So common was it that whenever someone went missing, it was the first place the police searched, and often as not, that's where the dead would be found. A faint gust of wind rustled the trees, the break in the silence causing her to snap out of her thoughts, and as she looked up, she saw something ahead. Her steps slowed. A single pale white blossom, small and delicate, peeking up from the dark soil at the base of an ancient oak. It wasn't a flower you'd find listed in any botany guide, but a rare species known only to a tiny number of shamans and herbalists, the number of which could be counted on one hand. Kneeling, she gently plucked it from the earth, carefully wrapping it in paper and slipping it into her jacket pocket. She'd found it. It was real. Closing her eyes, she whispered a prayer of thanks, but the moment she stood, she bumped against something hanging from the tree. She looked up, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A body. She scrambled backwards in shock, heart pounding. The figure dangled from a thick branch, head tilted slightly to the side, feet bare and skin pale. It swung gently in the faint breeze, and as it turned, the corpse's face came into view. A face identical to her own. Cold rushed through Sarah's veins like ice water, her breath shuddering out of her lungs. It wasn't possible. But there she was, the same dark hair, the same freckle beneath the left eye, the same silver locket, her grandmother's, resting against a motionless chest. The corpse's head lolled slightly, mouth parted as if to whisper some terrible secret. Sarah ran. About 30 minutes later, she burst from the forest, stumbling onto the gravel road, gasping for breath. Her knees hit the ground, but she barely felt the pain. What she'd seen was impossible. She must have hallucinated it. It had to have been a trick of her mind, a product of grief and worry and too many sleepless nights. The sun hung low in the sky, pale and distant, but having gotten out of the forest, she focused on catching her breath and calming herself down. She was out. She was safe. It hadn't been real. It couldn't have been. It was almost nightfall when Sarah got back home, so exhausted and stressed that at first she didn't even notice that Juno hadn't come bounding to greet her soon as she'd unlocked the door. But as she put her jacket away, she noticed her dog laying in the middle of the living room, sprawled out on the rug, apparently asleep. Sarah knelt down beside her, fingers ruffling the golden retriever's fur. But there was no response, no rise and fall of her ribs, no warmth beneath Sarah's trembling fingers. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, then gathered the dog up in her arms and wept. Juno had only been a couple of years old and perfectly healthy. Dogs like her didn't just die for no reason. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, Juno's empty bed a dark void in the corner of the room. Sleep didn't come for many hours, and when it finally did, she dreamed of rope tightening around her throat. Sarah's grandmother had been a Yarb Woman, a healer skilled in herbal medicine and folk remedies, but who never made a dime off her knowledge. She practiced her arts free of charge for the community, helping any who asked of her, and had been much loved and respected in town. But serious diseases required serious medicine, and when Sarah's younger brother had been born small and sickly, he'd been given only a couple of weeks to live by the doctors. It was for him that their grandmother had braved Black Hollow, traveling there to gather a rare and nameless white flower, said to grow only where people had ended their lives. Apparently, she'd found what she needed, and the medicine she'd brewed had saved his life. It would have been a happy time had tragedy not struck thrice. First, Sarah's father had died at the local mine, crushed when the coal seam he'd been working came crashing down around him. Second, her uncle burned to death in a freak house fire, the cause of which was never determined. Finally, Sarah's grandmother had returned to Black Hollow and never came back. The next morning, Sarah buried Juno, then didn't waste a moment in preparing the medicine she'd risked the trip to the forest to collect. Following the directions in her grandmother's notebook, she placed the strange flower in a cast-iron pot of spring water, bringing the infusion to a slow simmer over a fire made from black birch and hickory wood. She stirred in a sprig of sweet fern, whispering a protective phrase over the brew, and once the tonic had thickened slightly, removed it from the heat, adding a single drop of wild honey, then a single drop of her own blood. By evening, she was at the hospital, seated at her son's bedside, his small, frail hand in hers. The place smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. The doctors spoke in hushed voices, glanced at her with the same somber expression they always gave families with no hope. It was a rare cancer that was taking her little boy. Aggressive, painful, already at stage 4 and completely inoperable. They'd told her that even if she'd had all the money in the world, there was no hospital that could cure him. That there was nothing to be done but make him comfortable as they could and wait for him to pass. But carefully and secretly, she had him drink the elixir she'd prepared. Sarah sat beside his bed for days, her hand on his heart, feeling the warmth slowly growing in his skin and the beat strengthening. His lips went from dry to flush, his voice from thin to happy. A week later, the disease was eradicated, the dumbfounded doctors unable to do anything but marvel at the miracle. Together, Sarah and her son returned home, but as great as her happiness was, it was marred by what came next. A kind co-worker collapsed at her desk from a freak heart attack, pen still clutched in her fingers. Her sweet next-door neighbor lost control of his car on the highway, the vehicle careening off the road and into the wall of an overpass, his body smashed beyond recognition. Then her son's best friend was attacked by a rabid dog, his throat torn out right in front of his screaming mother. The boy had only been 10. Sarah sat through funeral after funeral, hands clasped in her lap, lips pressed into a thin, pale line. She'd tried everything to drive away the curse. She'd swept her home with a broom made of sweet gum, taking the dirt and tossing it into a nearby river so it could never return. She'd burned bundles of juniper pine needles and sage till everything in her place reeked of smoke. She'd washed herself in witch hazel and salt water, hung a Rowan cross above her bed, poured raw salt and filed iron across every door and window. But nothing had worked, and with the death of her son's friend, she knew she could no longer deny it. It was as her grandmother had said.
The only way to stop it is to pay its price.
The tree stood ancient and waiting, its thick limbs stretching outward like an invitation. The noose swayed slightly, though the air felt still. Sarah stepped onto an upturned piece of wood she'd placed beneath it. The forest smelled rich and damp, the scent of decay curling at the edges of her senses. She had tucked her grandmother's notebook away in her library, written a long letter to any who might use it one day, which she slipped between its pages. Wrote another to her son telling him just how much she loved him, telling him that nothing she'd done or was about to do was his fault. Without a doubt, people would think she'd gone mad, would think her unworthy of the miracle that had been granted her, would think all kinds of horrible things, though perhaps none so bad as what she'd actually done, and what she needed to atone for. Her hands were steady as she looped the noose around her neck. Sarah exhaled slowly, emptying her lungs to make the passing faster. Then, she kicked the wood beneath her feet away.
Like and subscribe for more horror and mystery stories.